In this video, I'm going to explain more about how to aim train effectively than any other guide I've ever seen or made. If you're new, this will help you a ton. If you have 1,000 hours, I still think there are some ideas in here that you may learn from because a lot of people with many hours train wrong. This is a video that I wish I had when I started. I'm an aim coach. I've worked with multiple professional Valorant players, streamers like Noted, Apex Predators, Overwatch Grandmasters. You guys all get the point by now. I make a lot of aim routines. So first we have to look at what kinds of scenarios exist in aim trainers. If you don't already know, scenarios are just individual exercises that exist within aim trainers. In my opinion, scenarios can be pretty easily divided into 4 categories. The first 2 are flicking and tracking. Flicking is any scenario that requires you to flick to a target. Tracking is any scenario that requires you to hold a target. There are some scenarios that will require both skills. When you play a scenario like Vox TS where the target has very low health, even though it has some health and is required to be held, it is a flicking scenario. Scenarios like Ground Plaza where targets spawn in the same place every time and you only have to switch between targets every 20 seconds or so are tracking scenarios. Scenarios like Smoothbot target switching are somewhat a gray area, and these are called evasive target switching. Flicking and tracking can both be broken down into 2 categories as well, reactive and predictable. When your brain has to perform a motor function, it needs to develop a plan. Your reaction time is how quickly you can develop that plan to do a task, and improving at that task and reacting to it can help improve your reaction time. People tend to think of reaction time as how long it takes to see something and register it, but the motor plan is also a big part of reaction time. You may have 150 milliseconds reaction time on the human benchmark for clicking a mouse, but this will slow down as the task has more variability. When you have to flick to a random target on screen, it takes longer than if you flick to a specific point you know in advance. If you want to know more about this, you can Google Hicks' Law, but I also put a few good references in the description. So predictable scenarios and aim trainers give you more time than is needed to create a motor plan and get a good score. Reactive scenarios require you to develop a motor plan faster in order to improve your score. If you're playing a scenario like 1 while 6 targets small, you'll be able to flick to every target and plan out your next target before you even finish your kill, even if you aren't consciously aware that you're making this plan. When you play a scenario like Smooth Your Wrist, you are given a bot that moves in one direction at one speed and then switches its direction at a fixed point, meaning that you know exactly what the bot movements will look like and you can track it without ever needing to react. Reactive scenarios are ones that require you to flick or track a target in a way that requires some reaction, and a faster reaction time would help your score. For example, in Ground Plaza, the bot switches directions unpredictably and it stops unpredictably, forcing you to react to follow it. While these scenarios are usually treated as binary categories, either smooth or reactive or predictable or reactive, there is some gray area. Scenarios like Smoothbot or PGTI require someone to follow a target that will unpredictably switch directions, but not often. They are predictable, but not completely predictable. For flicking, there's reactive scenarios that would be like scenarios with 1 wall and 1 target. These scenarios require reaction after each flick so that you can get to the next spot as quickly as possible. There's also a lot of flicking scenarios where a target will appear and then disappear after a fixed period of time. This forces you to develop a plan quickly. However, due to the way these scenarios work, there's a limited number of bots. If you can improve past a certain point, you will be no longer challenged for reactivity as you'll have plenty of time to flick to the target. Due to the fact that after a certain skill level, these reactive flicking scenarios start to feel predictable, they won't help you improve at reacting, and there also becomes this kind of gray area as of when does a certain reactive flicking scenario become predictable for me. The standard 1 wall, 1 target scenarios will never become predictable as you always need to react faster to get a higher score. The only limit in score is human biology. However, these scenarios don't give immediate feedback as to whether or not you reacted very quickly after each flick. For that reason, I'd recommend looking for a reactive flicking scenario with a target that appears and disappears that is challenging for your skill level. Check out Target Acquisition Flick, Cooler TAF, and Reflex Flick variants for some good options. Next, I want to talk about click timing or clicking, not to be confused with clicking the subscribe button, which is also something you should do if you want good aim. Click timing or clicking is a subcategory of flicking that requires you to click on targets that will die after 1 click. That means that theoretically your mouse never has to stop, you simply have to click when your crosshair passes the bot. Within click timing, there are 2 types of scenarios, static clicking and dynamic clicking. Predictable static click timing makes up what most of new aim trainer players waste their time on. Scenarios like this can include 1 wall 4 targets small Voltaic, 6 shot, grid shot, 1 wall 6 targets small, tile frenzy, and a ton of other really popular scenarios. In reality, these scenarios are pretty niche and only good for a few things. One of the main uses is using these scenarios to really refine your technique and work on shakiness. If you are very new to aiming with a mouse and keyboard, a reaction component may be mildly overwhelming, and focusing on these kinds of scenarios only for a week might help, but after that, even if your scores are still bottom tier, I'd recommend including at least some reactive scenarios. Anyone up until the best in the world can benefit from predictable static clicking, but its main function is just to refine your technique towards perfection, which isn't entirely useful if you can't react, and it isn't entirely useful if you don't speed up and actually flick to people before they kill you. Learning is done through errors, and speed increases will help you make errors. If you make these speed increases in static clicking, your errors will say each slight miss is an error, clicking too soon is an error. This is not how games work. If you flick to a guy in Valorant or CS and you shoot a shot and you're off by a bit, but then you adjust and get the kill, you didn't really do anything wrong. You aimed at a pace that you should have aimed, and not missing could have helped you, but you would have had to aim so slowly that you probably would have died before you got the kill. If you aim at a pace where you're moving really quickly and getting errorless kills, chances are you're just aiming too slowly and you will not get to the enemy's head in time in most situations. You need to aim a bit faster and make some errors in game. Target switching or flicking scenarios that have full auto weapons and targets that have almost always more than one shot worth of health allow for a much better simulation of in-game flicks. These scenarios allow you to push speed and make errors that aren't really errors without getting told you're wrong. You're allowed to practice flicks that are more paced like you would pace in game, and still see errors and therefore improve from them, but not feel forced into a slower pace. For that reason, static clicking and target switching work well together for improving the mechanical aspect of flicking in game. Static clicking for the true refining of technique and accuracy, and target switching for really getting into practicing speed and proper pace. What I described is actually technically more of a niche application of target switching. Most people use it kind of like static clicking, and it allows them to perfect their technique, which is fine. It's just training a different set of skills. If you want to be good at a game that requires flicking, I'd recommend pushing speed at least some of the time, but also if you want to do this and refine your technique with target switching, that's completely fine as well. I do this all the time. Finally, there's reactive static clicking and reactive target switching, featuring scenarios like target acquisition flick, cooler TAF, reflex flick variants, 1-1-1 target scenarios, as well as reflex target switching scenarios, which are perfectly fine for improving flicking in a reactive context. I haven't seen reactive target switching implemented in an appear-disappear context. I've only seen it in Pokeball 1-1 target scenarios as of right now, but I would like to see it in an appear-disappear context in the future. Reactive flicking scenarios, especially reflex scenarios where a target appears and disappears, in my opinion, are the most important for training for games, as games tend to follow the enemy appears and you have a set amount of time to kill before you're dead, and it forces you to get better at reacting, which is required for engagements. All flicking skills are brought together in these scenarios. If you were to train one flicking scenario a day, I'd recommend it be one of these. However, if you actually have time to train, I'd recommend using a variety of different scenarios, as I mentioned above, to isolate the specific skills that you need. Combining reactive and predictable target switching and clicking is a really good way to train your ability to flick to targets in games, whether it be an Apex sniper rifle, attack FPS, COD, whatever. One other use of predictable static clicking is to force an extreme amount of precision on scenarios where the bots are so small that you can't even hit them. Scenarios like 1 wall 20 targets extra small work very well for this. On the other hand, grid shot and tile frenzy can allow you to feel mouse movements way faster than anything you'd make in any other context. Now let's talk a bit about dynamic clicking. Dynamic clicking is just static clicking, but the targets move. Because of this, you can have reactivity coming from the fact that you have to find a target, like a 1-1 target scenario, or from the fact that you have to react to the target's motion. In scenarios like Passu, you have a randomized bot switching directions and when you have to try to aim at it. In scenarios like popcorn, you know exactly where the target's going to land almost 100% of the time. You never really have to react. For dynamic clicking, predictable scenarios allow you to work on the ability to read moving targets. Reactive scenarios work on this reading, but the enemy changes in direction, which for some people can be helpful, and for others it can be overwhelming. The difficulty of the scenario will also affect whether or not it's too hard to read that the bot changes in direction and that it's moving. You may very well be able to handle random tile frenzy-sized bots, but you can't handle anything smaller. For the sake of an example, let's look at counter-strafing in Valorant, which is a simple AD-AD strafe pattern. You need to react when the enemy switches in directions, as well as have the ability to know how they are moving. In a scenario like pass to extra small horizontal, you will be required to react to the randomized movement of the bot and hit a moving target, which requires reading the target, making the scenario train both the skills needed for this strafe pattern. If that's overwhelming you, or you're particularly bad at hitting moving targets in general, playing a scenario like Floating Head's timing will allow you to focus on just the horizontal motion of a bot. Keep in mind it is good to be uncomfortable with a scenario, but being overwhelmed is when you'd struggle to even process or do anything. For reactive dynamic clicking, I generally prefer accuracy scoring over reload scoring, as it forces you to actively try to read and react to the bot. A reload scenario where you have a bunch of bullets and you can just spam click usually leads to not trying to actually read the bot. These scenarios should only be reload scoring if you're trying to train the ability to very quickly hit these targets, similar to static clicking versus target switching. However, in this category, I would say that accuracy score dynamic is by far the dominant variant, as it really forces you to focus on the specific reactive reading skills that you're actually trying to train. A lot of people will end up confusing dynamic clicking and tracking, oftentimes using them interchangeably. Tracking is when you have to hold on to a moving target. Dynamic clicking just allows you to intercept the target briefly on its path and hit it once. In a game like Valorant, you do not need to track heads, you simply click them once with most guns at most ranges. That being said, in order to click a target, you need to be able to confirm you're on that target, and oftentimes be able to hold that target for some short period of time, meaning that tracking will to an extent help dynamic clicking scores in scenarios and games that mimic dynamic clicking, but it is not a replacement and it is not the same thing. Also, tracking will help you make the precise adjustments you need to make when you get close to a target, but again, it is not a complete replacement for dynamic clicking. They are different skills. Tracking is, however, extremely useful with a ton of benefits. When you flick and you do not land exactly on a target, you will need to adjust onto that target. Tracking scenarios practice the precise control of making these adjustments when you're trying to get back onto a target and when you're tracking a target. It also has the main obvious of benefit of forcing you to learn how to track targets as you would in games that require tracking. Predictable tracking allows you to learn the basic fundamentals of tracking, and it can also be used to challenge your ability to make precise movements. For example, hitting someone far away in a tracking intensive game is hard. Trying to learn the level of control it takes to hit them while they're jumping around dodging your bullets is borderline impossible if you're new. Using a small predictable bot can help. The bot doesn't even have to be 100% predictable, like hit it with your eyes closed predictable. You just don't want to feel like you're struggling with your reactions. Some control sphere variants, but not all, work really well for this. Once you get better at this, use a small unpredictable bot like the one in Cartoon Sphere to kind of force you to react every now and then. This bot will force you to be very precise but also react. A big mistake I feel like a lot of people make in their training is when they train with significantly larger targets than the enemies they fight in game, and they get extremely good at hitting these large targets, but they never practice getting good at the precise control they need to aim at very small targets in game. I once worked with an Overwatch Grandmaster who was ethereal in the RA benchmarks, a top tier aim lab player. I gave him a few mental tips and a few small target scenarios, and in his words, he got 10 times better at aiming in Overwatch. Learning to hit small targets gives you the control to hit heads, but there's one other aspect to hitting heads instead of bodies, whether it be flicking or tracking. You need to be able to unconsciously treat the head as the desired target instead of the entire enemy. There's a few pretty good ways to practice this in aim trainers. First of all, you can play scenarios where the targets have heads and simply focus on hitting them. You can also section out a part of the target and treat that as your target. A pretty popular application of this is called edge tracking. What you do is simply put your crosshair on the edge of a bot opposite to its motion, and when it changes direction, go to a different edge. This not only trains you to aim for the head more easily, but also gives you more wiggle room to react when the bot switches direction. Obviously, this will make the reactivity aspect of tracking scenarios easier if done effectively, so using the edge tracking technique all the time may not be ideal for you. Finally, I wanted to talk about everyone's favorite topic when they start aim training, your expected results after some time training. Progress can be seen in two ways: scores and clips. Scores will go up by learning to play the scenario better, and sometimes just by the bots being randomly slightly closer together, and it's very hard to notice the difference between two similar clips. So you can't really track small gains in progress. Instead, pick a couple of scenarios to use to track your skill. You can use scenarios that you find to be cool, or you can use like a benchmark sheet, which is a list of scenarios that associates scores with ranks, like the Revosect benchmarks are my Valorant specific benchmarks, and Revosect also has their own Valorant specific benchmarks. You can then use massive progress in these scores to see your skills improve. I personally started using the Season 3 Voltaic benchmarks as they were the main benchmarks when I started. For the sake of seeing my overall progress, I've kept with these benchmarks my entire time. I would not really recommend comparing yourself to the percentile of scores and scenarios, as a large percentage of players are a very similar skill level, so 20 to 80% might not be that big of a gain, and different scenarios have very wildly different skill levels of people who play. I would not recommend comparing yourself to the percentile you score in scenarios, as a large percentage of players are very similar in skill level, and different scenarios have wildly different skill levels of who plays. A lot of times it's easier to get a world record or a very high score in a scenario with more plays than one with less plays, because the one with more plays isn't really considered a competitive leaderboard by those who are the best and really competing for hard world records. Obviously, this isn't a direct relationship. The scenario with 20 plays will be less competitive than the scenario with 100,000 plays 99.9% of the time. But a lot of times, the scenario with 100,000 plays is an easier world record to get than the one with 10,000 plays. To see true progress in game, I'd recommend taking your 5 best clips you have now and saving them in a folder. Every 3 to 6 months, take another 5 best clips. The new 5 should always look a lot better than the previous 5, assuming you trained enough. Thanks for watching until the end, and make sure you subscribe if you want more aim training content.